This is Fox 11 Forum, a look at issues of concern to Tucson and Nogales, with your host, Bob Lee.
Good morning. I hope you're having a nice weekend. My guest this morning retired a few years ago after a long and successful career in the world of academia. That career took him from California to New York and Pennsylvania and ultimately to Tucson, where he was president of the University of Arizona from 1997 to the summer of 2006. Now, Peter Likins has written a very personal memoir outlining his family life. It's a story most of us can relate to, as we'll discuss with the author in just a minute. My guest this morning was the 18th president of the University of Arizona, holding the post from 1997 until he retired in the summer of 2006. And while his professional life is filled with accomplishments, it's his personal life that's even more amazing, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, which he's put together in this book. Peter Likins is the guest. The book is called A New American Family, A Love Story, and it is published by the University of Arizona Press.
Indeed.
Thank goodness. Thank you for being
Indeed.
with us.
Good to be here.
Before I talk about your remarkable story, and it's interesting. I mean, I've been here through your entire reign on the University of Arizona campus, and your family life was not something that we knew a lot about. I think with regard to your son and the unfortunate incident there, that did get some coverage, but by and large, we didn't. You know, you sort of kept that in the background. Before we talk about that, since you've retired, a couple of parts about your schooling was in engineering.
Yes, that's
and
right.
you're retired president of university. Notre Dame called upon you to look into an incident that occurred there a year ago. Tell us how that came about.
A tragic death of a young man named Declan Sullivan, who was a videographer associated with the football program on an elevated lift.
Not unlike what we have here.
Oh yeah, and several students were on lifts at that on that same occasion, videotaping the practice so the coaches and the players can improve their performance. And they were very careful in advance of the football practice to check the weather and check the wind speed, and everything was below the threshold they'd set for themselves. But then they went out on the field and the winds continued to gather. And they weren't continuously monitoring during practice. And just during practice, the wind speed went up very dramatically, and there was a gust of 53 miles an hour. And it knocked over one of the three lifts that had student videographers on them, and Declan was there and died in the fall. So it was a tragedy, and I got a call, unexpected, because I have no association with University of Notre Dame, but a call from the president asking me if I would kind of monitor their response. I was not expected to do a study, but I was expected to give them advice as to how they should conduct a study, and then review their work and critique and make sure the president knew from me if I ever sensed that they were being in any way defensive or obfuscating the truth. And so I took that mission very seriously. Got to know these people and visited a couple of times, and they were quite amazing in the candor with which they faced that tragic experience. And I learned a lot in the process, but I hope I contributed too. I was the university president for 24 years. You cannot do that job without facing tragedy in the course of that span of time.
And that report just came out April 18th. And,
yeah, that's right. The incident was in late October.
Factors, and we won't go into that, but it points out that somebody knew something about this university president that also might know something relating to the structures that were involved.
Sure, I'm an engineer, and so as an engineer I could comment and critique the work of their technical people in a way that perhaps nobody else in that administration could. They hired really good people. They had on their faculty a world-class wind engineer who could also oversee the work of the consultants they brought in. So they did an excellent job technically, and also they faced reality in a very candid and open way. So I'm proud of participation, proud of the president, proud of the way they handled things.
Well, it's just one more facet of your very interesting life. I want to back up now and talk about you and your family and so forth. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Santa Cruz, California. That's where I went to high school and junior high school. That's where I met my wife when I was 13 years old. So we were in school together and got married when we were just 19, engaged when I was 18.
Yeah, don't gloss over that. You were teenagers when you got married.
Yes, well, I was.
Not many teenagers stay married.
That's true, but you know, if it works, then you share everything in a way that few married couples do. So we've been married 55 years now, and we can share memories and share friendships to go back to high school and even junior high school. I met her when I was 13 at my junior high school graduation dance. I mean,
did you know you were going to go to college at that point? I mean, do you have any idea what your career might be?
Well, I grew up in relative poverty. My mother was raising 4 kids on her own. And somehow we knew, without a lot of lecturing, that education was the pathway out of poverty. And so from early childhood, I knew that I had to do well in school because that was the way out. That was the way to find your way in the world. So without any talking about it, I was always doing my very best in school, and therefore had scholarships all the way through.
Now you're 19, and you and Pat decide you're going to get married, even though you're, starting to put together your educational program, and she's certainly thinking about what she's going to do. Did anybody try to talk you out of that?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, my mother was afraid I'd never get out of college, and of course I never did until I was 70. I was in college for a very long time. But yeah, she was particularly apprehensive. There's no father in the story, and so I really had to be very clear with my mother that I'm going to do this. And she had to sign it in the state of California.
You weren't 21.
A young man under 21 needed parental signature, not a young woman. That was
18, I think, for women.
But my mom had to sign that thing, and she just didn't want to sign it,
Now, how much of a challenge? I mean, how do you support yourself while you're
scholarships? I worked in the summer, and I had very generous full ride scholarships, academic scholarships at Stanford. My wife was a nursing student out of high school, and she dropped out. And so she worked in whatever job was available to her.
And then she went back and finished it.
Yeah, I finished my bachelor's, finished my master's, again on scholarships at MIT. I had very generous support at Stanford for my undergraduate years.
So you went from Stanford to Boston.
Yeah, I went to Boston. What a big adventure for a small-town California kid. It was just a great experience, and we love Boston still. Then I went to work at Caltech at the Jet Propulsion Lab after I had my master's, just in 1958, the very first year of space exploration. My wife started over again at Pasadena City College. She did very well, and then she qualified to transfer to Stanford for her junior year. I went back to Stanford for my doctorate. And again, I had a fellowship. We were paying her tuition until we ran out of money, and then she dropped out again until I finished my doctorate, and we started adopting kids, and I got a faculty job at UCLA. And then she went back to school at Cal State Northridge with 4 kids and got her bachelor's degree and then her teaching credential. So for the first 10 years of our marriage, I was in school, or she was in school, or we were both in school. 10 years.
All right, and you mentioned you started adopting kids, and I want to talk about when kids came into the family, because that really gets to the uniqueness, in a sense, of the Likins family. But there's a lot of people in this country who are in that same situation. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Stay with us. We'll be right back. We were talking with Peter Likins, the author of A New American Family, A Love Story. You mentioned you started adopting kids. How did the conversation start where we might want to adopt a kid, and how did you pursue that?
Well, we've loved kids, both of us, and I was still a graduate student. We had a couple of miscarriages, and my wife's mother informed us that she knew a young woman, girl, who was pregnant and was looking for a family to adopt. And so just through doctors and lawyers, still anonymous, but without an agency involved, we identified this young woman and agreed to adopt her child when that child was born. So we saw her when she was 8 hours old and brought her home after 3 days. And I was still a graduate student. Then I went off to my faculty job at UCLA, and about that time adopted a second child.
Now the first one was Laura, and that was the one that she had a heart issue?
Yeah, when we first took her for her physical at 3 weeks of age.
And somebody say, well, you should take her back?
The doctor said, take her back. Amazing. The doctor said, this child will not live. She's too small for surgery. She's got a hole between the chambers of her heart. Do not adopt this child. And my wife's a very tough lady. I literally slumped to the floor. I mean, I was just devastated. My wife was devastated too, but she's a tough lady. And she said, this is our baby. So we walked away with that child.
And today she's fine.
Oh, yeah. And she's a 48-year-old nurse right now and doing very well. Does not have a heart problem. But for 10, 12 years, we went through a series of pediatric cardiologists monitoring her heart, and slowly the wound between the chambers of her heart healed. So she was approved for track in high school.
And so then Paul comes along, and he's Mexican-American, Germanic.
Yeah, that's true, and that was irrelevant. We became aware of a second child, born to a Mexican-American woman, but that was not a factor. You know, we just...
It was a child.
Baby. She was a child. So we had 2 kids, and we went off to UCLA as a young faculty couple with 2 kids. That seemed like a perfectly stable...
Yeah, until John came into the picture.
No, Krista came into the picture.
Oh, Krista, okay, yeah, you're right.
Krista was born exactly 5 years to the day after Laura, after her first child.
And these are babies when you got them?
Yes. The first 2 were
newborns,
3 and 4 days old when we brought them home. My wife saw Krista on television. There was a show called Adoption Interviews, run by a dear man named Ben Hunter. My wife was homesick with the measles, and she was watching the movie on television, and Ben Hunter, after the movie, introduced on screen a few children who were in the days that I'm referring to in the 1960s. They were unadoptable by virtue of age or race or illness. This child was black. Now, I got home that day, and my wife might as well have said, honey, we're pregnant. She said, we're going to have another baby. And we didn't, you know, it's strange in retrospect. We didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that she's a black child. She was just a beautiful child. She needed a family. We needed the kids in our family. We wanted to have 4 kids. And so we went forward, not really worrying about the fact that white people weren't supposed to adopt black people in the 1960s. It just wasn't done.
Doesn't matter anymore.
Doesn't matter anymore. America has changed.
And that's part of what you try to point out as this thing goes along.
And the story of the book is not just the story of my family. It is, in my opinion, the story of America. We're watching America change before our eyes. In the course of my lifespan, America's changed very dramatically. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to look ahead to the next 30 years.
Absolutely.
And see that the American demography is changing inexorably. And multiracial kids, each of our two quote, black kids are born to white mothers and black fathers. That's the Obama story, right? And that's a very common story in America. And it's rapidly unfolding because multiracial families almost mathematically increase their presence in the American population. It's the most rapidly growing sector between 2000 and 2010, between those 2 censuses. More than one race was the category that grew most rapidly, grew by 33%.
Speaking of more than one race, you decided to mix the stew a little more, and you got Terry and Linda?
Yeah, well, my wife was watching that same damn show some years later. I mean, we were happy.
Who says there's nothing on television?
Yeah, right. And she saw this beautiful 10-year-old Indian girl whose parents had both died and who was in foster care, and beautiful child. And my wife is a loving woman, and her heart went out to that child, and she said, let's think about this adoption. It was more complicated because she was 10 years old, and we had a 9-year-old and an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old. And then Teresa said, our daughter, our prospective daughter, said, yeah, I'd love to join this family, but please bring my sister too. So Linda, age 7, joined the family also. That was in 1972, and we've stopped adding to the family. Although when the Vietnamese boat people were in such trouble, and there were Vietnamese children for homeless kids coming to the shores, we signed up for that too. And they said, nah, 6 is enough. You don't need any more kids.
I want to skip ahead here a little bit because I want to make sure we talk a little bit about John and some of the issues, again, that a lot of families are dealing with. One of the things that I mentioned at the beginning is you moved around a lot. You went from California to New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and so forth. How did the kids handle this bouncing from one major metropolitan area to another?
You know, it's bouncing only because I'm 75, and there's a lot of years there. I was 12 years in Los Angeles, and then 6 years in New York, and 15 years in Pennsylvania. So each of those stays was a substantial stay. For the kids, they're all California kids. And when Columbia came calling, I was a UCLA professor, and I had an opportunity to be Dean of Engineering. Now, I really hesitated. But my wife said, let's go. So we packed up 6 kids, 5 cats and 2 dogs, and moved across the country in our travel trailer. And it was a challenge for our kids because they were maybe grade school or in some cases junior high level. But
they had friends.
The good news is there were 8 of us. And one of our survival strategies, frankly, over the decades, has been to stay tight as a family. And whatever else happens in the world around us, whatever kind of reactions other people have to us.
We're the Griswolds.
Yeah, we hold tight to each other. You know, it's funny, our kids think of adoption as children. They thought of adoption as normal. In fact, one of our children came back from the 1st grade and said, Mommy, do you know that lots of kids live with the people who made them? I mean, they thought of our family as a normal family. And it's a multiracial family, you know, Indian kids, black kids, brown kids, white kids. But they didn't think about that either. You know, they were just, of course, they had different colors, but different sizes and different...
You know, the world's in color, so...
yeah, I mean, it's not a big deal when you have so many in a tight family.
As with many families with children, there can be some challenges, health-wise and otherwise, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Stay with us, we'll be right back. We are talking with Peter Likins, the author of A New American Family, A Love Story. And you mentioned John, who was your 4th child. Tell us a little bit about him, because I think a lot about John, really a lot of people can relate to, because there's nothing really abnormal about his life. There was a lot of challenges, but nothing that I wouldn't go so far as to say can be quite typical.
Yeah. I wish I had an hour to talk about John. He was the joy of our life for so many years. And I wrestled as a kid, and he was a very talented wrestler, Pennsylvania State high school champion. And my wife and I coached the sport. And although we were close to all of our kids, John was the youngest, and he was very, very special. And then at 17, John began exhibiting the characteristics, symptoms of schizophrenia. Not recognized by us or by anybody, although we saw psychologists and various people. He got into drugs, which in retrospect was self-medication. He was calming his anxieties. He'd go into the basement and sit in a dark room all by himself, trying to shut out the stimuli that created fear, anxiety for him. But we didn't understand what was happening. We saw John as developing, beyond all imagination, a drug problem. And so we followed that course for several years, 2 or 3 years, before we finally got a schizophrenia diagnosis.
And this was with the assistance of professionals?
Oh, yeah. We put him in a drug rehab, and there are psychiatrists there, and social workers and nurses, and it's a very common combination, because schizophrenics typically, at that age, 17 or 18, begin to exhibit those feelings, those anxieties, those fears, oftentimes reacting with fear to stimuli, to the visual or audible stimuli, and they try to calm themselves, firstly with alcohol, and it works. But you keep that up, and pretty quick, if you have certain vulnerabilities, you find yourself an alcoholic. And in these days, of course, drugs are everywhere, and alcohol is never quite enough. And so John was until his death at 33, a dual diagnosis patient, as they say, both a schizophrenic and a drug addict. And struggling with the balance of these two things.
When through all of this did it finally become, was a diagnosis that said he has a mental illness?
Well, it was probably about 3 years or 4 years into our experience with trying to manage the drug addiction. And that was a relief to us in the sense that it enabled us to explain how this perfectly wonderful kid on his way to Pitt, he got a scholarship, how he could have collapsed in the way that he did. But it wasn't very helpful to him, because he would rather be a drug addict than be crazy. And the stigma associated with schizophrenia or other mental illness is so powerful in our society today that the patients don't want to accept a permanent medication for the rest of their lives. So it's a balancing act that is extremely difficult to maintain.
And through this particular experience, you become quite a spokesperson and an advocate on behalf of mental health issues.
I have. I've learned a lot, and although you mentioned earlier the fact that I was living in this presidency without a lot of people knowing about my family experiences, they've never been secret. It's just that people focus on your presidential role because that's what they see. But we've lived with John's problems, and John's not alone. I mean, I've dealt with a lot of challenges with all 6 of my children, and in ways that have been very meaningful to us, helping us become better people, stretching us sometimes painfully, making me a better university president, because I understand in a way that most white folks don't. Yeah, all of the complexities that we have a gay son, and that's another tough lesson for a guy who came up in the 50s when, quote, there were no gay people. You know, there was a visible, invisible element of our society. And in every student body, in every society, there are gays and lesbians, and they're people too, and they need to be understood. And you need to deal with your responsibility as a university president in a way that is responsive to the needs of all of your students, whatever their sexual orientation or race or ethnicity or language or religion. And I learned a lot from my kids that helped me in my presidency, just as I learned a lot on campus that helped me with my kids.
What do you hope people will learn from the book?
I hope people will face squarely the fact that this is not just another funny family. This is America. And all the experiences that we're having, that we've had in my family, are routinely experienced in American families all over the place. And when you look to the next 20 years or 30 years, you're going to see an America that looks kind of like the cover of this book. You know, people like me, white Americans, are going to be minorities like every other subpopulation. In California right now, 73% of the students are, quote, minorities. I mean, it's just bizarre. So America is going to change. And I want people to read this book to think about that and be ready for that.
It's a fascinating book. Again, it's called A New American Family, a love story by Peter Likins. I've read it. It's what I call an easy read because it is so fascinating, and there's a lot of activity and information in this relatively short book. I recommend that you pick it up. Thank you very much for taking time to come in here and talking with us again.
Thank you very much.
I enjoyed talking with you. I'm going to try to find an excuse to have you back in a little bit.
I'm retired.
Maybe when the paperback comes out, it'll be time to come back and
oh, there's an electronic version that's about to be released.
Yeah, there's an electronic version of everything anymore.
Yeah,
that's what the Nook is for. Thank you again very much. That is our program for today. I'm Bob Lee. Have a safe week ahead. Remember, if you're in a motor vehicle, please buckle up for safety. If you're driving it, I'd appreciate it if you'd give me a signal before you change lanes or turn corners. And no texting while you're driving. Always be on the lookout for motorcycles and bicycles. See you again next week.